For 14 years, Elijah Carter had rehearsed this walk in his mind. The long gravel driveway, the black iron gate, the smell of magnolia trees in the Savannah heat. He had pictured it 1,000 times from inside a 6x9 cell, and now that it was finally happening, he refused to let anyone see him cry. He did not call his son. He did not call his wife. When the warden handed him a manila envelope containing his old wallet, a set of keys that no longer opened anything, and a wristwatch with a dead battery, Elijah simply walked out into the Georgia sunlight, hailed a cab, and gave the driver an address he had not spoken aloud in over a decade. 14 years earlier, Elijah Carter had been the founder and CEO of Carter Maritime Freight, a shipping and logistics company he had built from a single leased tugboat into one of the busiest private ports on the eastern seaboard. He had done it with nothing but a high school diploma, a war-surplus vessel, and a stubborn refusal to fail. He had a younger brother, Reginald, whom he had made chief financial officer the day the company incorporated, and a wife, Denise, who had stood beside him at every ribbon cutting, every bank meeting, every sleepless night when the business nearly collapsed. Then, one gray October morning, federal agents from the Department of Justice raided Carter Maritime's headquarters. They found falsified customs manifests, a labyrinth of shell accounts in the Caymans, and financial records bearing Elijah's digital signature. He was charged with conspiracy to commit tax fraud and international money laundering. He always suspected the case wasn't as simple as it looked, but he had trusted the people around him to fight for his name while he sat in a federal courtroom, watching his own signature condemn him. He was sentenced to 18 years. He served 14 before a court-ordered digital forensics review, triggered by an unrelated cybercrime case, uncovered irregularities in the timestamp metadata of the very documents used to convict him. A judge signed an emergency order. Elijah Carter walked free on a Tuesday afternoon with no fanfare, no reporters, and no family waiting outside the gate. That was exactly how he wanted it. The cab dropped him at the end of the driveway of the house he had built for his family in the Ardsley Park neighborhood, a colonial-style home with white columns and a wraparound porch. The oak trees were taller now, heavy with Spanish moss, but everything else looked untouched, preserved like a photograph. He walked to the porch, reached beneath the third flower pot from the left, and found the spare key exactly where he had hidden it 15 years before. His hands, weathered now from a decade of prison labor, trembled slightly as he turned it in the lock. The door opened without a sound. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. It was warm, quiet, and completely undisturbed, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had learned, over 14 years surrounded by men who would slit your throat for a pack of cigarettes, to trust that feeling. He set his bag down gently and moved down the hallway toward the back study, the room that had once been his father's library. The door was cracked open, spilling warm light onto the hardwood floor. He heard the clink of ice against crystal, and then a voice, his brother Reginald's voice, relaxed in a way it had never sounded in the handful of letters he'd sent to prison. "The lawyer called," Reginald was saying. "Elijah's out. Some clerical error voided the whole conviction." Elijah froze mid-step. Then came his wife's voice, cool and clipped. "That's inconvenient timing. Did you finish moving the Ashcroft account before the auditors circle back?" "Already done," Reginald said, and Elijah heard the satisfaction dripping from every syllable. "Every dollar's rooted through the Nevis shells and sitting in the Liechtenstein account. That old man doesn't have 2 nickels left to rub together, and he never will." Denise laughed, a low, humorless sound Elijah had never once heard from her in 22 years of marriage. "Good. Let him come home. What's a broke ex-convict going to do? If he tries to make trouble, we'll have him committed. We've got power of attorney. Nobody will ask questions about a man whose mind fell apart in prison." "To us," Reginald said, and Elijah heard glasses clink together. "To the buyout and to never looking back." Elijah stood in the hallway, absolutely still, feeling something in his chest crack open and go cold. He did not gasp. He did not cry out. 14 years in a federal penitentiary had taught him one unbreakable law. When you are surrounded by wolves, you do not whimper, you watch, and you wait for your moment. His hand, trembling with a rage he refused to let surface, brushed against a small ceramic vase on the hallway table. It toppled and shattered against the floor. The voices in the study stopped instantly. "Did you hear that?" Reginald's voice had lost its swagger. "Probably just the wind," Denise whispered, though her voice wavered. Elijah did not run. He did not hide. He kicked the broken shards aside and stepped calmly into the doorway of the study. Reginald and Denise turned, drinks frozen halfway to their lips. The color drained from both their faces as though they had seen a ghost. In a way, they had. The trusting man who went to prison 14 years ago was gone. Standing in his place was someone else entirely. Reginald was wearing their late father's cufflinks, the ones Elijah had left in the safe the day he was arrested. Denise was wearing an emerald bracelet Elijah had commissioned for their 15th anniversary, the one she had once told him she'd sold to pay legal fees. "Hello, Reginald," Elijah said, his voice low and level. "Hello, Denise, I hope I'm not interrupting a celebration." For 3 seconds no one moved, then Denise broke first. The ice in her eyes melted into practiced tears, and she rushed across the room, throwing her arms around his neck, sobbing his name into his shoulder. He felt nothing but the cold weight of her perfume, which now smelled to him like poison. A moment later Reginald embraced him too, gripping his hand with theatrical relief, insisting they hadn't known he was coming home, that they had missed him terribly. Elijah let them play their parts. Then he stepped back, his forced smile gone. "I missed you too," he said, dangerously calm. "But before we celebrate, what $10 million? What account in Liechtenstein?" The room went silent. Denise's sobs caught in her throat. Reginald's jaw tightened. But Reginald had spent 30 years learning how to talk his way out of anything, and he recovered with terrifying speed. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair, playing the burdened martyr to perfection. "Elijah," he said gently, "when you were convicted, the federal government came after Carter Maritime with everything they had. They wanted to seize every dollar to pay fines. Denise and I had no choice. We moved the liquid assets into an offshore trust to protect them from federal seizure. That's the Liechtenstein account you overheard. We played the villains so the company would survive. We did it all to protect your legacy." It was, Elijah had to admit, a masterful lie, plausible, technically fluent, delivered with practiced sorrow. If 14 years in a cell hadn't sharpened his instincts into something razor-thin, he might have believed it. But he remembered exactly how much money had been in his retirement accounts before his arrest, and he knew a legitimate asset protection trust didn't require laundering funds through 3 anonymous shell corporations. They were lying to his face, and they had underestimated how carefully he was listening. He let his shoulders slump. He let his eyes water. He pulled them both into an embrace, whispering broken apologies, thanking them for everything they had sacrificed. Over Reginald's shoulder, his eyes were bone dry, and his mind was already 3 steps ahead. They thought they had fooled a broken old man. They had no idea the war had only just begun. Within days, Elijah understood the shape of the cage they had built for him. He was moved into a small guest room at the end of an isolated hallway. For his own safety, Reginald said, since his knees shouldn't have to manage the stairs after so many years on a prison cot. He was given $80 a week in cash, told his accounts were still frozen by federal regulators. He was forbidden from setting foot inside Carter Maritime's headquarters, warned that his presence would destabilize the company during a sensitive transition period. He agreed to all of it without complaint. He played the part of the weary old man, grateful for whatever scraps of comfort his family allowed him. But behind the closed door of that windowless room, his mind worked with total clarity, cataloging every detail, every inconsistency, every piece of stolen property flaunted in front of him as though he were too far gone to notice. Each night Denise brought him a cup of chamomile tea, insisting it would help with the trauma of reintegration. For the first week, he drank it out of caution, playing along. Then he began waking each morning wrapped in fog, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his vision blurred at the edges, symptoms he had never experienced in his life, not even after 14 years in a cage. He remembered Denise's icy voice in the study, joking about how the world expected a convict's mind to deteriorate. He tested his theory. The next night, while Denise stood watching him drink, he pretended to swallow and instead let the liquid slide into a napkin cupped in his palm. He poured the following night's dose into the soil of a large fern by his window. Within 2 days, the plant was dead, leaves blackened, stem collapsed, roots rotted through. They weren't just stealing his fortune. They were poisoning him, slowly and deliberately, to make certain that if he ever tried to reclaim his life, no judge would believe a word he said. From that moment on, Elijah stopped being a victim trying to understand his family's betrayal. He became a survivor preparing his counterattack. Late one night, once the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 2, Elijah slipped silently down the hallway toward Reginald's home office, once their father's library. The lock was a simple pin-tumbler mechanism, laughably easy for a man who had spent a decade sharing a cell block with men who'd once made a living picking locks for a fee. Using a paperclip and the metal edge of a disposable razor, he had the door open within 90 seconds. Reginald's home computer required a password, but Reginald was a man ruled by ego. Elijah tried the name of his brother's prized retriever, followed by the year he'd purchased his lake house. The screen unlocked on the first attempt. What he found turned his blood to ice. Reginald hadn't simply stolen money. He had repurposed Carter Maritime's entire shipping infrastructure to move dirty cargo and dirtier money for a criminal network operating out of the Gulf ports, disguising the transactions as consulting fees and freight surcharges. And every document, every falsified manifest, was still stamped with Elijah's digital signature, a paper trail engineered to make sure that if federal investigators ever came sniffing around the new activity, it would lead straight back to the man already sitting in prison. Buried at the bottom of a hidden partition was a folder labeled simply 2011 Archive. Inside it, Elijah found the original forged documents used to secure his conviction, and a file titled Testimony Prep, a script detailing exactly when Denise should pause, when she should look tearful, and how she should describe his supposed erratic behavior on the witness stand. She hadn't been coerced. She had been the architect of his downfall. He was no longer fighting to recover his money. He was fighting to reclaim 14 stolen years of his life. He needed help, and he needed it from someone he could trust completely. He thought of Marcus Webb, the sharp young attorney who had defended him at trial, and refused to abandon the case even after Reginald orchestrated a smear campaign that got him disbarred. Marcus had lost his career for standing by Elijah, and Elijah had spent years quietly promising himself he would make it right. Elijah slipped out of the estate the next morning, shuffling and trembling for the benefit of the hired health aide, a broad-shouldered man named Otis who trailed him at a lazy distance and traded a crumpled $50 bill to a teenager in the park for an old cracked smartphone. Connected to the coffee shop's open Wi-Fi, he sent one message to a number he had memorized during a single supervised legal visit years before. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice sharpening the instant he recognized Elijah's name. "They said you were out. I've been waiting for a signal. They think my mind is gone," Elijah whispered. "They think I'm harmless. I found the ledgers, Marcus. I found everything." Marcus's contacts inside the financial sector had already picked up chatter. Reginald wasn't just laundering money anymore. He was preparing to sell Carter Maritime outright to a group of overseas buyers for $240 million in clean capital. Planning to vanish with Denise the moment the deal closed, the sale was scheduled to finalize within 3 weeks. Elijah had 3 weeks to dismantle an empire built from his own stolen legacy. The days that followed were a slow campaign of quiet cruelty. Reginald began flaunting Elijah in front of the foreign buyers who visited the estate, introducing him as his tragic, senile older brother, laughing as the men mocked him with polite, condescending pity. Elijah absorbed every insult in silence, memorizing every face in the room. 2 nights before the company's 60th anniversary gala, Reginald cornered him by the fireplace, unclasping their father's cufflinks and setting them on the mantel beside an old family photograph, gloating about how their father had always favored his weaker, older brother, and look at them now. Elijah bit down hard enough to taste blood and said nothing. At dinner the following night, Reginald slid a thick legal document across the table, a full liability waiver, permanently surrendering Elijah's remaining claim to Carter Maritime. It was, Elijah understood immediately, the exact signature needed to let the foreign buyers close the deal without fear of future legal disputes from the company's original founder. Elijah let his hands shake violently, playing the frightened, confused old man. When Denise leaned in and threatened him with a medical conservatorship, warning that his final years could be spent strapped to a bed in a psychiatric facility if he didn't cooperate, Elijah broke down convincingly, agreeing to sign. But he refused to do it quietly. "I built this company from nothing," he stammered. "If I have to sign it away, I want to do it properly, on a stage, in front of everyone at the anniversary gala. I want to say goodbye to my life's work." Reginald and Denise exchanged a calculating look. A public signing would be the perfect optics for the buyers, they agreed. Elijah lowered his head, hiding a cold, satisfied smile behind his trembling hands. The trap was set, before the gala. Marcus, disguised as a visiting phlebotomist drawing routine bloodwork, slipped Elijah a small item during a supervised bathroom visit. A fountain pen with a specialized ink that would chemically fade from paper within 24 hours of exposure to air. And a tiny hidden earpiece connected to a secure line. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is primed," Marcus whispered, running the sync to mask their voices. "If Reginald figures out what's happening before you use that pen, they'll have you committed before sundown. Move exactly as we planned." The night of the gala, Denise dressed Elijah in an ill-fitting, outdated tuxedo, meant to make him look as diminished as possible for the cameras. He let his hands fumble with the buttons, let his knees buckle slightly as she pinned a boutonniere to his lapel, gripping his chin and hissing that after tonight, he would officially cease to exist. He nodded weakly. In his pocket, his fingers curled tightly around the cold barrel of Marcus's pen. The ballroom of the Marriott riverfront glittered with crystal chandeliers, and 300 of Savannah's wealthiest guests, many of whom had abandoned Elijah the moment federal agents raided his offices 14 years earlier. Reginald took the stage first, delivering a speech dripping with false humility, calling Elijah's imprisonment a tragic chapter, and himself the loyal brother who had sacrificed everything to protect the family legacy. Then, with theatrical warmth, he invited Elijah up to give his blessing before the historic sale was finalized. Denise's grip on Elijah's arm turned to iron as she marched him toward the stage, forcing every step to look like an agonizing effort for the cameras. At the podium sat a thick stack of documents, the final relinquishment contract, worth nearly $250 million to men Elijah recognized immediately as far more dangerous than European investors. He signed every page with trembling, theatrical hands, letting the tremors vanish the instant the pen touched paper, executing his true signature with total precision. Reginald snatched the signed contract from the podium the second the pen left Elijah's hand, holding it aloft to a ballroom of polite applause. As he leaned in to embrace his brother for the cameras, Reginald's mouth pressed close to Elijah's ear. "Thanks for the company, old man," he whispered. "The men in white coats are waiting out back." Reginald turned to quiet the crowd for his closing remarks. Instead of shuffling off the stage, Elijah rose to his full height, let his cane clatter to the marble floor below, and stepped calmly to the microphone. "Thank you, Reginald," he said, his voice ringing clear and unshaken through the ballroom speakers. The polite applause died into stunned silence. "Before our buyers wire $240 million into an offshore account, I think they deserve to know exactly what they're purchasing tonight." Reginald lunged for the podium controls, slamming the mute button uselessly. Marcus, disguised in a stolen catering uniform, had already locked the audiovisual booth and rerouted every feed. The massive screen behind the stage went dark, then blazed back to life with rows of falsified manifests, offshore wire routings, and shipping logs linking Carter Maritime directly to a transnational smuggling network, all authorized under Elijah's forged signature. The 4 European investors in the front row bolted for the exit, abandoning Reginald the instant their compromised network flashed across the screen. Elijah gave a second signal, and the recording of that very first night, Reginald's boastful confession, Denise's cold laughter about power of attorney and nursing homes, thundered through the ballroom speakers, stripping away 14 years of manufactured sympathy in under 2 minutes. Denise collapsed onto the stage floor, weeping, her carefully built persona shattering in front of the very socialites who had once envied her. Reginald grabbed a backup microphone, screaming that the audio was fabricated, that Elijah was a convicted felon trying to sabotage a legitimate sale, waving the signed contract over his head like a shield. "You should check your buyers," Elijah said quietly. Before Reginald could process the warning, the ballroom's heavy doors burst open. Tactical agents in vests marked FBI and SEC stormed the room. The 4 investors didn't flee, they drew badges from beneath their jackets. They had been undercover federal agents from the start, embedded in the deal for years, waiting for Reginald to personally and publicly claim sole ownership of the tainted assets. Precisely what his signature on that contract had just done. Elijah stepped close to his brother, his voice low and even. "Did you really think I spent 14 years in a cell doing nothing? I've been a confidential source for the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division for the last 4 years, Reginald. We tracked every account. We just needed you to step out from behind my name and claim it as your own. That contract you're holding isn't your escape, it's your signed confession." He reached into his jacket and produced a second document, proof that years before his arrest. Sensing something was wrong in the company's books, he had quietly transferred every core patent and proprietary shipping algorithm out of Carter Maritime into an anonymous holding company called Ironclad Ventures, a company he alone controlled. Carter Maritime had merely been leasing the technology that made it valuable, under a license that explicitly prohibited criminal activity. Reginald had built an empire on borrowed foundations, and that lease had been terminated the day before. Reginald's knees gave out beneath him. He wasn't just losing a stolen company. He was now personally, legally liable for over $100 million in debt to men who did not forgive unpaid debts. Denise crawled toward Elijah, clutching at his pant leg, sobbing that Reginald had forced her, that she'd never stopped loving him. Elijah looked down at her with the same cold clarity he'd shown the dying Fern in his room, and dropped a small glass vial into her lap, the last of the poison she had spent a month feeding him. "Tell it to the judge," he said, and stepped back as agents pulled her to her feet. 6 months later, Elijah stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of a new office overlooking the Savannah River. Reginald and Denise had each been sentenced to 25 years without parole for fraud, laundering, and perjury. The seized shell network had been dismantled by federal task forces. Ironclad Ventures had since launched its own logistics software to sweeping industry acclaim, and Marcus Webb, fully reinstated to the bar and newly installed as chief operating officer, poured 2 glasses of bourbon in quiet celebration. Elijah raised his glass toward the skyline, thinking of the 14 years he could never reclaim. They hadn't been wasted. They had sharpened him into something unbreakable. Trust, he had learned, is the most valuable currency a man can hold, and blind trust is the fastest road to ruin. The deepest betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who smile across the dinner table while quietly plotting your downfall. But time is patient, and truth, however long it takes, always finds its way to the surface.